Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for joining me here today. It's so hot outside. Really, it's hot. We're going back 111 years. And why 111 years? Well, there are a lot of things that happened in your parents' and your grandparents' lifetime, your uncles, your aunts, great uncles, that still impact us today. That's Woodrow Wilson, who was the President of the United States beginning March 4th, 1913. And women want the right to vote. Among the words you see there, demand. We demand an amendment to the Constitution of the United States and franchising the women of this country to vote. That's what they want. Wilson's a racist. Woodrow Wilson is a racist and doesn't hide it. The Arab-Israeli conflict may have started over a bunch of grapes in 1913. A bunch of grapes. That's where the Arab-Israeli conflict may have started. The Second Balkan War, which would lead to World War I. There was a revolution in Mexico, and the United States is involved in this revolution in Mexico. The assembly line starts. This is the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and that's an old Model T that was pulled apart so you can see all the parts that were assembled into this car, and they all came off the assembly line. Movie censorship. Did movies have freedom of speech under the Constitution of the United States, yes or no?
No.
We'll talk about that. The world's tallest building opened. That's the Woolworth Building, and that is in Lower Manhattan. And that was old man Woolworth deciding he needed a flagship office in the United States, and he builds this building, the tallest building in the world at that time, in Lower Manhattan. The Lincoln Highway. There was a highway system that started in 1913. And that's in Wyoming, and you can't see it, but my son is right there at the bottom of the statue, and that's part of the Lincoln Highway going through Wyoming. It was a highway system in 1913. Grand Central Terminal opened up. How many of you have gone through Grand Central Terminal? Yeah. And it opened up. And the New York Highlanders baseball team, and there's me, this is about 35 years ago, the New York Highlanders baseball team became the New York Yankees in 1913. So you got Woolworth Building still around. Lincoln Highway is basically still around. Israeli-Arab conflict still around. The Woolworth Building is still around. So a lot of things that happened in 1913 are still around and are still being used. And they are the most famous sports team in the United States, and maybe in terms of American export of sports, maybe the most famous baseball team or sports team from North America around the world. How many of you do crossword puzzles? Do crossword puzzles? Mm-hmm. First crossword puzzle in the newspaper in 1913. Still 111 years later, crossword puzzle. The bra was invented. Do you know the bra was invented in 1913? It was. Still around. You're shaking your head.
I didn't know.
You didn't know?
I know nothing.
You know nothing. Well, the bra was invented back in 1913. But anyway, let's start with the 1912 presidential election. Woodrow Wilson elected president by a landslide. November 5th, 1912, Woodrow Wilson was elected the president of the United States. He was not a career politician. In fact, he had been the president of Princeton University, and that started in 1902. Around 1909, 1910, New Jersey Democratic Party was in shambles, and they were looking for anybody. And they said, hey, why don't we try this guy Wilson? He's done an okay job at Princeton University. Let's see if he can become governor. And he did. He became governor of New Jersey in 1910. Wilson was not a serious contender to be the Democratic 1912 presidential nominee. A guy by the name of Champ Clark, who had become the Speaker of the House after the Democrats take over the body in the 1910 elections, was the front runner for the nomination. Three-time presidential loser, William Jennings Bryan, lost in 1898, 1900, 1908. And he still had enormous clout and power in the party, despite the fact that he was a three-time loser. He said, I'm going to support Woodrow Wilson. And on the 46th ballot of the Democratic Baltimore Convention, Woodrow Wilson starts his road to the nomination. Meanwhile, the Republicans are in disarray. Here's Theodore Roosevelt, and there is William Howard Taft. The Republican Party in 1912, the former President Theodore Roosevelt challenged the nomination of his former cabinet officer and hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft. Apparently, Roosevelt was itching to get back into the game, and he did not like the way Taft ran the country between 1909 and the Republican Convention. Along with other progressive Republican leaders, Roosevelt split with Taft over administration policies, particularly in business interests in maintaining high tariffs on imported goods and failure to pursue Roosevelt's conservation program in the West. Teddy Roosevelt liked national parks. Apparently, William Howard Taft didn't. And he comes up with a party. It's called the Bull Moose Party, progressive party. And he is going to peel support away from Taft if he can. He forms the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, after he lost the 1912 Republican presidential nomination to Taft. Why Bull Moose? Well, Roosevelt boasted that he felt as strong as a bull moose when he was going to run for president in 1912 after losing the Republican nomination in June, and hence the Bull Moose Party. Debs, Eugene V. Debs, the socialist, he's also in this race. The 1912 election with Debs. In years prior to World War I, the Socialist Party had grown in strength, electing 2 members of Congress, over 70 mayors, state legislators, and city councilors. So they're not a party to dismiss per se. Well, Woodrow Wilson would win the 1912 presidential election. There is Wilson. He's having a good laugh with William Howard Taft. On election day, Wilson received over 6 million votes. Roosevelt, 4 million votes. Taft, 3 million. You take Roosevelt and Taft together, that's 7 million votes. That would have beaten Woodrow Wilson. Wilson's election made him only the second Democrat to win the presidency since the Civil War. Victory gained with only 42% of people voting for Woodrow Wilson. Despite being outpolled or outnumbered by the combined total voting for Roosevelt and Taft, Wilson's victory in the Electoral College was overwhelming, 435 electoral votes, 88 for Roosevelt, and the incumbent Taft got only 8 electoral votes. That had to be a humiliating defeat for William Howard Taft. Wilson did win, but the deciding factor was not his appeal to voters. It was the Taft-Roosevelt split, and he was the beneficiary of that split. Most American women could not vote in the 1912 election, and that is a problem. This is Alice Paul. And Alice Paul is going to throw a parade for Woodrow Wilson the day before Woodrow Wilson became President of the United States. But the thing is about this parade, it was going to put Wilson on notice. Not that we're happy you won, but you better listen to us. We want the vote. So Alice Paul comes up with an idea. Alice Paul realized that being polite and asking sweetly for the right to vote was not getting women anywhere, and that radical tactics were necessary. For a woman, that might mean standing on a street corner, holding a sign, or speaking from a stage. Those were considered radical acts. A woman, I'll give you an example here. Take Me Out to the Ball Game, at this point, is only about 5 years old. And the song is sung by Katie Casey. She tells her boyfriend, take me out to the ball game. Women weren't supposed to do that. The The men were supposed to say, we're going here. And the woman says, yes, hon, I'm going with you. Women weren't supposed to be seen at baseball games. It was beneath the dignity of a woman to be at a baseball game. And yet Katie Casey is singing the song, Take Me Out to the Ball Game. So Katie Casey was not a refined woman. And there were a lot of women who were not refined by those days' standards. So anyway, she's arrested 7 times and imprisoned 3 times in England in 1908, in 1909, after moving to England and getting involved in the English women's suffrage movement. She learned that a hunger strike, that might be more effective getting attention than just saying we want the vote. So she comes up with this grandiose plan the night before Wilson becomes president, or the day before. Paul returned to the United States in 1910, turned her attention to the American suffrage movement after the deaths of Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1902 and Susan B. Anthony in 1906. The women's voting rights movement was languishing, no focus. Some of the people said, let's concentrate on getting votes in the states. But that Alice Paul, she said, you got to do it through the Constitution, and we are going to show you how to do it. Women's suffrage. Well, you can get arrested. You can get arrested for protesting the fact that women did not have the right to vote. As my wife is the model there, in the Henry Ford Museum of all places, that you could get arrested as a woman if you demanded the vote. 1911, Alice Paul led the first street corner campaign for the right to vote night after night for 2 months, speaking from a horse-drawn cart. Paul and other suffragettes made their case to crowds that sometimes numbered in the hundreds. At her side was a woman by the name of Lucy Burns, who was from Brooklyn, who she met, Alice Paul met, in a London police station. She also was protesting, even though she was an American, she was protesting for English women to vote. And there is Lucy Burns. Paul and Burns offered to take over the National Women's Suffrage Association Congressional Committee in Washington, D.C., which was tasked with promoting a constitutional amendment. Paul topped her action with a plan for a parade, a spectacular, a spectacle, never seen before in Washington, D.C. Hello, Mr. Wilson, President-elect Wilson, we're here. We are reminding you that we're here and you better do something about what we want, which is the right to vote. This is the official program, Women's Suffrage Procession. No sooner was Paul's parade underway than thousands of onlookers spilled into the path. They were not happy, the onlookers. They blocked its progress. Men spit at the women. Men spit at the women. They threw lighted cigarettes. They hurled insults, while police stood by and did nothing. Now, the police were there to protect the women, but they see what's going on and they just basically turn their backs. They're not going to prevent violence. Well, to the surprise of many, Alice Paul was actually pleased by all the chaos. The reason why? The parade made news from coast to coast, and it is now coast to coast because Arizona and New Mexico joined the Union in 1912. There are 48 states now. On March 3rd, the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration, 8,000 mostly female marchers wearing white or clad in colorful caps and capes, interspersed with mounted brigades and decorated floats, unspooled on Pennsylvania Avenue. This was supposed to be a spectacle, and it was. The first float, we demand an amendment to the Constitution of the United States enfranchising the women of this country. What do you think of the word demand? Is it an okay word or not?
Of course it is.
It's what? Demand. What, you said something?
I said, of course it's a good thing. It's the best thing.
Demand. Word demand.
Yes.
Well, demand was an incendiary word. Something nice women didn't do. You didn't demand anything of your husband. Didn't demand anything of your boyfriend unless you were Katie Casey in the song. You demanded, take me out to the ball game. You're supposed to be a nice woman. Nice women did not make any demands. They went along with the flow. They were putting an unsympathetic Wilson on notice that they expected action and expected it soon. Wilson ran on a platform called the New Freedom, and it's an interesting platform. He tried to sell Americans on new freedoms. That included, or the proposal stressed individualism and states' rights. Federal government, even though I'm an employee of the federal government as the President of the United States, I mean, honestly, all politicians, President, Vice President, members of Congress, members here in Norwalk, City Council, are all government workers. That's what they are. They're government workers. Get government benefits and all that. Americans were engaged in a serious debate about the power of corporations. Does that sound familiar? The power of corporations? They were talking about that in 1913 and the role government played in regulating the economy. Wilson thought that one of the government's central challenges was how to best curb the threat of corporate consolidation in power. I'll give you an example now. How many of you used to go Macy's or Gimbel's or Barney's clothing store or S. Klein's or Gertz or Stearns, all that? How many of you used to go to those places? How many of those places still exist? All those corporations have been folded up into a few companies. Target, Walmart, Amazon now online. Macy's is owned by, I think, Federation right now. Used to have a lot of choices, right? Don't have those choices anymore. So he was worried about corporate consolidation, and he was influenced by his friend Louis Brandeis. And Brandeis warned him about the curse of business, bigness. Wilson offered a progressive vision calling for the use of government power to break up monopolies, curb corporate power in politics, promote economic competition. Does that sound familiar? It seems like we've been speaking about this for the last 10, 15 years. Same thing. Nothing has changed from 111 years ago. Wilson courted the African-American vote in 1912, and this is Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. This is up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where he supposedly lived as a boy, and they have a little... This is W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm going to explain who that is in a second. After decades of loyal support, by 1912, many African Americans grown disillusioned with the Republican Party and its record, and its failing record of civil rights. The view was particularly true with regards to Taft, whose campaign barely acknowledged the black community, in part to avoid alienating Southern whites, whom Taft mistakenly believed could be swayed by the Republican candidate. African Americans initially dismissed Wilson's campaign out of hand. However, Wilson, to the surprise of many, appeared highly responsive to the concerns of the black community. In his correspondence with representatives of the black community, which included leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, he promised to answer their grievances if elected, and made a point of promising to be the president of all Americans. And again, there is Du Bois. Du Bois was one of the people, or Du Bois rather, no, Du Bois. He was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He was a Pan-Africanist, or ist, and he was concerned about African American rights in the United States. Wilson never expressly renounced his prior views on segregation and race relations, but many, like Du Bois, took him at his word and his actions, such as receiving black leaders at his home on multiple occasions, showing that he was a changed man. But was he a changed man? Wilson's most active and prominent supporter from the black community in 1912 was the scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, who campaigned enthusiastically on Wilson's behalf. Du Bois endorsed Wilson as a liberal Southerner who would deal fairly with Negroes and whose economic plan would benefit African Americans, all Americans. Well, the Postmaster General of the United States under the Wilson administration showed that Wilson was not a changed man. His name was Albert Burleson. And in his first month in office, the Postmaster General, Albert S. Burleson, urged the President to establish segregated government offices. On April 11th, Wilson gave his cabinet secretaries discretion to segregate their respective departments, and that would be the post office in particular. Wilson's cabinet and administration was dominated by racists. The Postmaster General, Albert Burleson, was devoted to the institutionalized segregation. And he began segregating post office employees by race. Well, Burleson also fired black postal workers in the South. The post office was one of the few places that African Americans could get good jobs in America, and Burleson is ready to pull the rug from underneath. Wilson did not officially direct the implementation of segregated policies, but he welcomed them under the guise of the argument that it would reduce friction among government workers. Wilson was not a changed man at all, and this is 1913. Looks like it's a train station, colored men's waiting rooms, white men's waiting rooms. Segregation. You're waiting for a train, you're waiting for a bus, you stayed in separate rooms. You could not be combined. By the end of 1913, many departments, including the Navy, the Post Office, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, along with the Interior, the Marine Hospital, the War Department, Commerce, the Government Printing Office had segregated workspaces, restaurants, and cafeterias. Many agencies use segregation as a pretext to adopt white-only employment policies on the basis that they lacked facilities for black employees. African Americans employed prior to the Wilson administration were either offered early retirement, transfer, or they were outright fired. So Wilson's first policy is basically to segregate the federal government. He's not a changed man, not a changed man at all. Wilson's policy led to the reduction of black civil service workers' income, increasing the significant income gap between blacks and white workers, and eroding some of the gains black people had made following Reconstruction. Wilson was a supporter of the lost cause, and also he grew up in the South, and he didn't like what he saw in the South, that black men were free all of a sudden after being enslaved in his childhood. He was born around 1858. Well, this is rather interesting. This is Palestine. The first Aliyah kindergarten in Palestine, and that was in 1898. And the Jewish people who flocked to Palestine all of a sudden start setting up schools and start setting up farms and start basically living life in the Middle East. Jews came mostly from Eastern Europe and from Yemen. They left Europe because of the pogroms and the violence against the Jewish communities in those areas. An estimated 25,000 Jews immigrated. Many of the Jewish immigrants during the late 19th and early 20th century gave up after a few months, and then they went back to their country of origin because they were suffering from hunger or disease, or they tried to get into the United States or what is now Canada. The first Aliyah led to the cornerstone for Jewish settlement in what would become Israel. The first Aliyah was also known as the agriculture Aliyah. It was a major wave of Jewish immigration to the Ottoman Empire, or Ottoman Palestine, starting in 1881 and ending in 1903. program ended when the Zionist movement ran out of funds. This is Rehoboth, and it is 1893, and that's where Jews settled. The reason why they settled there, well, they were able to buy land. It is Yakov Street there. It was founded as a moshava, or an agricultural settlement, in 1890 by Polish Jewish immigrants who had come with the first Aliyah, seeking to establish a township. This particular settlement would not be under the influence of Baron Edmund James de Rothschild and would be located on land which was purchased from a Christian Arab by the Mehua Venahala Society, an organization in Warsaw, Poland. It wasn't Poland then, in Warsaw, that raised funds for Jewish settlements in Palestine. In 1890, the area, the region, was an uncultivated wasteland with no trees, houses, or water. And they planted a citrus grove. It was planted by a guy by the name of Zalman Minkoff in 1904. Minkoff's grove, surrounded by a wall, included a guardhouse, stables, a packing plant, and an irrigation system in which groundwater was pumped from a large well from the inner courtyard. The agricultural community of Palestine was established. And there's the city of Rehoboth. Something happened on July 23rd, 1913, between colonists, and they were all colonists because it was the Ottoman Empire, by colonists and guards of Rehoboth and Arab-ruled population. And that's considered by historians as a milestone in the Zionist-Arab relations in the late Ottoman Palestine time. The incident started over a simple accusation of a theft of grapes. Grapes, think of this, just grapes, from a Jewish-owned vineyard. Because it became much more than a local incident, which left one Arab dead, 2 Jews dead, and resulted in a tremendous amount of hostility between the two sides. The killings considered the start of the downfall of the relationship between the Jews and the Arabs in the Middle East. The peaceful coexistence among Jews and Arabs, united under the Ottoman Empire, instantly became an us versus them fight. More than 900 Jews lived in Rehoboth. And this is the map. That's where they lived. That's the map. Small area, rather small area, 900 people. In 1890, the first sign of strain appeared. There was a land dispute between members of the Jewish community of Rehoboth and the Bedouins who had been living and farming on that land but had no Ottoman deed to prove ownership. The Jews bought the land outright, demanded that the Bedouins leave without compensation. The Bedouins said, no, we're staying. In March of 1892, a dispute over pasture rights erupted between the residents of Rehoboth and the neighboring village of Zarnuka, which took 2 years to resolve. Another dispute broke out with the Saturian Bedouin tribe, which had been cultivating some of the land as tenant farmers. According to Moshe Smolinski, one of the early settlers of Rehoboth, the Bedouins had received compensation for the land, but they refused to vacate it. In 1893, they attacked the Moshava. Through the intervention of a respected Arab sheikh, compromise was reached, with the Bedouins receiving an additional sum of money, which they used to dig a well. The peaceful existence seemed to have ended before 1913. It was Sephardic Jews that settled the area, but now the Russian Jews are coming in, and things changed. In 1908, the Hashemar Hatzir pioneers of the Sijarat dismissed their Arab guards. They had hired Arabs to watch over their land, and they were afraid of the Bedouin raids and replaced them with Jewish guards. The group used the Sijahar for training the newly constituted Bar Giora Jewish Self-Defense Organization. For Jews, this is a statement of self-sufficiency. But for the Arabs, Jews had crossed the line, a red line. They had reneged on their part of the bargain, that Jews should not bear arms and should always look to the Muslims for protection. That is a very young David Ben-Gurion, very young David Ben-Gurion. And he's one of the guys who's there in Palestine, and he's one of the people on what is really a kibbutz. He was a farmhand, and then he became a guard 13 months later. There were about 200 Jews in that area at that point, and there would be one other change. As a spoken language, Hebrew, modern Hebrew, began to emerge in the late 19th century. On December 12th, Hebrew became the official language of instructions in Jewish schools in that region of Palestine. Now, people thought in the Ottoman Empire that they would be able to solve their differences, but there was a problem. The arrival of young Zionists threatened to overturn the existing local pecking order. The violent clash of July 23rd, sparked by a theft of grapes from a Rishon LeZion vineyard. Jewish and Arab leaders agreed to meet, sort out their differences, but the world has other problems. There's a Balkan War that needs to be addressed in Europe. There's a problem in Mexico, and we're not going to worry about this one Arab and these two Jewish guys who were killed out in the middle of nowhere in Palestine in 1913. They decided, let them handle it. Well, there's a second Balkan War, and this is more important to people because the Balkans are a problem, a big problem, and been a problem for over the last generation. On December 3rd, 1912, the Second Balkan War, or the First Balkan War, which becomes the Second Balkan War. Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, Montenegro were ready to sign an armistice with Turkey, ending fighting in the First Balkan War. During the 2-month conflict, a military coalition between Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, known as the Balkan League, expelled Turkey from all the Ottoman Empire's former eastern possessions, with the exception of Constantinople. That does not end the hostilities. On January 23rd, there's a coup d'etat in Turkey, and that led to the resumption of fighting after a truce agreement broke down on February 2nd. The Balkan League would once again be victorious. On May 30th, the Treaty of London officially ended the war and confirmed the independence of Albania. Albania had declared its independence on November 28th, 1912. Imposed by the great powers, England, France, Russia, Germany, Austria, Hungary, the Treaty of London satisfied few of the victors, Serbia, Montenegro, and Greece. They lost Albanian territory. They wanted it back. The treaty was not worth the paper it was written on. The Second Balkan War began when Serbia, Greece, and Romania quarreled with Bulgaria over the division of the joint conquest in Macedonia. On June 1st, Serbia and Greece formed an alliance against Bulgaria, and the war began on the night of June 29th, or the early morning hours of June 30th, 1913, when King Ferdinand of Bulgaria ordered his troops to attack Serbian and Greek forces in Macedonia. The Bulgarian offensive, caught them by surprise. It was initially successful, but in the end, the Greeks and the Serbian defenders regrouped, and they were able to win. On July 10th, Romania. By the way, how many of you have ancestors that came from this area? Some of you must.
This area means?
This area, the Balkans area, I'm talking about, like Romania, Greece, Bulgaria, Albania, Serbia. My wife's family came from Romania. Yeah. You have relatives that came from there?
Yes.
Where?
Albania.
Albania. 2 days later, Turkey, see, it all impacted you. You're here now. You might have stayed there, or your family might have stayed there. 2 days later, Turkey crossed into the territory, had lost to Bulgaria in the First War, surrounded, outnumbered, and with Romania threatening its capital of Sofia, Bulgaria agreed to negotiations that ended the war. Treaty of Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. Remember the song Constantinople, Istanbul, done in the 1950s, which had some funny words to it. Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Romania signed the Treaty of Bucharest on August 10th. Bulgaria and Turkey separately signed the Treaty of Constantinople on September 30th. The treaty would end hostilities. Well, temporarily it would. But there was an outgrowth of tension between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Serbia had extensive claims upon the Albanian territory. Having obtained the assurance of German support, Austria-Hungary delivered an ultimatum on October 17th to compel Serbia to withdraw from the Albanian borderlands. Austria-Hungary continued to wrestle with the question of how to handle Southern Slavs. There's a coup in Mexico, and the Americans are right in the middle of this coup in Mexico. Herrera's coup in Mexico. It's February 13th, and Victoriano Herrera leads a coup against President Francisco Madero. Madero is deposed, arrested, and jailed. With 3 weeks left in his presidency, William Howard Taft said the United States would not intervene as political disturbance in Mexico threatened American business interests there. Well, it was all set up by the ambassador to Mexico, the United States ambassador to Mexico, for this to happen. Despite Taft's stance, Henry Lane Wilson, Taft's ambassador to Mexico, pressed Taft to reorganize the newly installed Herrera regime. Wilson thought Madero was a lunatic and unfit to rule the country. Herrera and a guy by the name of Diaz met in Wilson's office to sign their treaty, which became known as the Pact of the Embassy. Under the deal, Herrera and Diaz agreed to overthrow Madero and turn the presidency over to Herrera. On February 22nd, Madero and the vice president, Pino Suarez, were shot to death. Herrera declared himself the president of Mexico. Once they heard the news, many Mexicans called Herrera the usurper, refused to recognize his administration, and declared themselves in revolt. Woodrow Wilson is livid. He's not even the president yet. He's absolutely livid, and he is giving his mind, or he's giving a mouthful to this Mexican in this cartoon. President-elect Woodrow Wilson had never been consulted about what Ambassador Wilson did, and he was livid over the deal. When Wilson took office on March 4th, he refused to recognize the new Mexican government. Wilson didn't like Herrera. He thought he was corrupt, he was violent, he was unreasonable, he was an alcoholic, and he didn't want him controlling U.S. interests in Mexico. Wilson and William Jennings Bryan, now the Secretary of State, sent John Lind, a former Democratic governor, of Minnesota, to Mexico to talk to the Mexicans. There, he's the personal envoy. Lind sought to persuade Herrera to call elections and not to stand as a candidate. He refused. The legislature was dissolved. A military dictatorship came in. The rule by Herrera was both ineffective and severely repressive. He was almost immediately confronted with opposition from constitutionalists who had the support of Woodrow Wilson. The assembly line. Anybody here own a Ford back in the day? Ford car? I had a Pinto. That was the one that the gas tank could explode. So I had to, they recalled it, put some plastic in there and all. That car was literally held together by rope and tape. Henry Ford invented the moving assembly line. The most common feature of this assembly line was the conveyor belt. The belts were used within other industries, including slaughterhouse. Moving product to the workers seemed like a better use of time and resources. The Ford Motor Company team decided to try to implement the moving assembly line in the automotive manufacturing process, and they did. His first fully implemented innovation was on December 1st. Like a lot of other industrial production insights, the assembly line was met with hatred and suspicion by many of his workers. The moving assembly belt was just one more way Ford could exert rigid control over his workers. They didn't like it. And that is the assembly line. And you can see the hubcaps are just coming down. They'll go to the guy who has the car there, and he can just put on the hubcaps. Assembly line work is incredibly monotonous. The line was seen as an insult to skilled craftsmen and another example of the overwhelming patriarchal control a company could have over its workers in the age of mass production. You know, movies were censored, and they were censored by local people. They weren't censored by the federal government. This slide here, approved by the Ohio Board of Censors. And they can censor any movie they want. Film production was based in Fort Lee, New Jersey back in those days. And if you go to the Fort Lee Library, there is an exhibit of when Fort Lee, New Jersey, excuse me, was the motion picture capital of the world. And of course in New York City. Chicago was the distribution hub, which meant all films had to pass through Ohio. Ohio's morality police influenced what films would make it to market. Other states banned films, like Kansas, much earlier than Ohio. Ohio passed a law forming a board of censors, which had the duty of reviewing and approving all films intended to be exhibited in the state. The board could order the arrest of anyone showing an unapproved film in the state. Movies could be banned for political or moral reasons. There's no nudity in any of these movies. The first nudity would be the next year, 1914. Or for controversial content, such as racism. This is a fight between James J. Corbett and Bob Fitzsimmons, and it becomes a movie, and it becomes the center of censorship, believe it or not, a boxing movie. Laws authorizing censorship of films in the United States began with the 1897 Maine statute prohibiting the exhibition of prize-fight films. Maine lawmakers enacted the law to prevent the exhibition of the 1897 heavyweight championship between James J. Corbett and Bob Fitzsimmons. Other states would follow Maine. Independently produced motion picture recordings of famous boxing contests were a leading factor in establishing the commercial success of movies in the late 19th century. 1896, the Catholic Church called for the censorship of one of the earliest known commercial films. It was a short called The Kiss, arguing that an on-screen kiss was immoral. I guess they had no problems in the 30s and 40s with the same thing. In the early 1900s, other religious groups called for federal regulation of the movies that they found indecent. Now, what they may find indecent is not something you would find indecent necessarily, or at least me. A censorship board that formed in New York pressured some movie theaters to close. Keystone Cops, remember them? Keystone Cops? Ask a kid what a Keystone Cop is today, they have no idea. Have absolutely no idea. But this is 1912, 1913, and that was Mack Sennett's Keystone Cops. The Mutual Film Corporation, a movie distributor, sought an injunction against the board in Ohio. Mutual argued that in addition to the violation of its freedom of speech, the censorship board was interfering with interstate commerce in violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause, and that the government had illegally delegated legislative authority to a censor board. And that would go to the Supreme Court. I'll tell you more about that in a few minutes. Lincoln Highway. That's a car roughly from that era, the Lincoln Highway. I was actually in a museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Had it in the back there?
Who?
On the side?
There's another car in the back. I can't see it that well from here, so it's hard for me because of the lights and all. I can see that it's an old car here, old car there, old car there, old car there. Old cars. Anyway, the Lincoln Highway. And you've probably been on the Lincoln Highway. Because you know where the Lincoln Highway started? Times Square. And what's next to Times Square? There's a tunnel. And what's the tunnel called? The Lincoln Tunnel. And that was the beginnings of the Lincoln Highway. The Lincoln Highway was the first of the transcontinental highways in the United States, one of the first highways designed expressly for automobiles, conceived in 1912 by the Indiana entrepreneur Carl G. Fisher. It was formally dedicated October 31st. The Lincoln Highway ran from coast to coast, from Times Square in Manhattan, west to Lincoln Park in San Francisco. Originally, the route went through 13 states: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and California. The Woolworth Building. Anybody been through the Woolworth Building? Yeah, it's a nice building. I don't know how efficient it is, although the top of the building is now residential, it's for residential apartments. At some time after 7 o'clock on April 24th, according to the New York Sun, I wrote for the New York Sun about 15 years ago, and then they went out of business. They never embraced, which they should have, the internet, but they never did, even though we told them to do so. According to the New York Sun, the original New York Sun, President Wilson pushed the button in Washington, a bell tinkled in the engineers' headquarters far below street level in the Woolworth Building, and thousands of lights, 80,000 lights by contemporary accounts, flashed on to signal New York's newest heaven-kissing tower was opened formally for service. It was 792 feet tall. It significantly passed all earlier construction, including two previous world's tallest buildings. The 612-foot Singer Tower, completed in New York in 1908, and the turn-of-the-century Park Row Building, which, counting its twin cupolas, stretched 391 feet into the air, half the height of the Woolworth Building. The estimated construction cost was $13.5 million. Today, that would be $416 million. It was an office building. Grand Central Terminal. I was there the other day. It's gorgeous. Penn Station's not around anymore. They're trying to rebuild it in some fashion. Grand Central Terminal opened in 1913. On February 2nd, Manhattan's Grand Central Terminal opened. It took about 10 years of renovation and re-engineering to get the place ready for business. More than 150,000 people from all over the city went to that strange station on opening day. Commuters could take ramps from train to street, and Park Avenue was elevated. That's where you go up and around. I'll tell you a story about that. Right after 9/11, my daughter was at NYU. She was living on 15th Street in NYU. And I was working at a place on Fifth Avenue. We had our studios for Metro Radio Network. And I had NYP plates, which is New York Press plates. And I'm going to pick up my daughter. This is September the 12th, 2001. She didn't come home on September 11th, but I was getting her the next day to get her home for a week or so to get her out of the area. And so I'm going around that roadway on top of Grand Central Terminal and then down into the tunnel. And a cop stops me as I'm going down into the tunnel. And he said, he looks at me, he sees I have NYP plates. He said, "You're a press?" I said, "Yeah, I'm press." He said, "Go through the tunnel. Don't stop at any lights. Just go through every light, because there is a threat at the Empire State Building. So just keep going, keep going, keep going. Don't stop. Don't worry. You won't. we're shutting off traffic, but you have special plates, so we're not going to shut it off for you. So I just went right through from the top of Grand Central Terminal, right through that tunnel on 34th Street, went down Park Avenue, made a left eventually to get my daughter, and then got out of Dodge as quickly as I could up the FDR Drive. And it was a threat against the Empire State Building, but nothing happened. Anyway, special areas of main traffic flow were created for passengers to greet people who had come to meet them. The original Grand Central Depot was built in 1871 by the railroad titan Cornelius Vanderbilt and was replaced in 1899 by a much larger but widely panned Grand Central Terminal. A catastrophic train collision on January 8, 1902 in the smoke-filled Park Avenue Tunnel killed 17 and injured 38, causing a public outcry and increasing demand for electric trains. By the end of the year, plans were in development to demolish Grand Central Station and replace it with a new double-level terminal for electric trains. Any New York Yankees fans here? You're a New York Yankees fan. They changed their name. They were the New York Highlanders. And this is the first year of the New York Yankees. And if you notice, they have the New York Yankees insignia today, which used to be a New York City insignia. And Fatima Cigarettes sponsored this team picture of the New York Highlanders. They were a bad team that year. They only won 57 games. They were a terrible team that year. It's generally accepted that the New York Highlanders owners changed the name of the team in 1913 to the Yankees. But that might not be entirely true. The first published reference to the American League franchise as the Yankees occurred on April 7, 1904, when the New York Evening Journal reported on the team's successful spring training camp under the headline, "Yankees will start home from South today." Baseball teams didn't have formal nicknames in those days. The Yankees also, that team was also called the New York Americans. The Boston team was called the Boston Americans, and there was another team in Boston, the Boston Nationals. So they really didn't have team names, and the newspaper people generally named the teams in those days. 1 week later, the New York Evening Journal coverage of the season opener was entitled "Yankees Beat Boston," with the term also appearing in the lead sentence of the article chronicling New York's 8-2 victory over Boston. There were numerous references to the ball club as the Yankees before 1913, including advertising and tobacco cards. The name New York Highlanders never grew popular with fans who found the Yankees name more appealing. Hold on, we've lost there. Anyway, the New York Yankees. There were numerous references to the ball club as the Yankees. In 1943, history of the franchise credits sports editor Jim Price of the New York Press, another paper I worked for, it was a weekly though, he was the one who began to refer to the team as the Yankees in 1913. The first crossword puzzle. How many of you still do crossword puzzles? Well, it came over from England. And this is the first crossword puzzle, by the way, that appeared in the newspaper in New York. First crossword puzzle was published on the fun page of the New York World on December 21st. It was invented by the British journalist Arthur Wynne, who emigrated to the United States in the late 1890s. His first crossword, or word cross, as he called it, did not look like the present ones today. It was diamond-shaped, no black squares, so they changed that up. Ever hear of Mary Phelps Jacob? She invented the bra, but you might know her by a better name because she was a publisher later on in life. So she invented the bra out of necessity. While preparing for a Manhattan debutante ball, Mary Phelps Jacobs felt frustrated. The dresses of the time were cut for slim, boyish figures. They featured on top of that plunging necklines. This combination for the well-endowed Jacob was awkward. She didn't like wearing a corset. Bring me, this is what she said, "Bring me 2 of my pocket handkerchiefs and some pink ribbons," she told her maid. The 2 did some quick sewing. Jacob tried on the resulting garment, and when the ribbons were pulled taut and tied, the effect was similar to that of a corset, but given the absence of whalebones, much sleeker. The new undergarment, Jacob recalled, was delicious. "I could move more freely, a nearly naked feeling. And the glass, I saw that I was flat and proper." She wore her invention to the dance that night. She went on to demonstrate it in dressing rooms of Manhattan society gatherings. She made more models of it using elastic bands, and for friends, soon she went to see a patent attorney. Jacob really didn't invent the bra. The concept had been around for years, but she came up with an idea in 1914, or she went after a patent in 1914. It was called the brassiere. You know what the brassiere means? Upper arm, in French. Upper arm, the brassiere. Well, the 1913 legacy and Woodrow Wilson. After an October 2nd, 1919 stroke, Woodrow Wilson was a near invalid. 25th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified on February 10th, 1967. It established and explained the complete order of presidential succession, as well as a series of contingency plans to fill any executive vacancies. Well, Wilson had a lot of things named after him, like schools, and there were a lot of protests just recently. His legacy is at best mixed. He did lead the country during World War I and was instrumental in crafting the League of Nations. He also trampled the rights of those who protested World War I by jailing them. He was also racist. He possessed a sympathy for the lost cause. In 1913, as I said, he gave his newly appointed cabinet the permission to segregate their departments. The Ku Klux Klan had a revival during his term. At Princeton University on June 27, 2020, the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs was changed to the Princeton School of Public International Affairs, and Wilson College was renamed the first college. On January 26, 2022, Camden, New Jersey's Woodrow Wilson High School got a new name, Eastside High School. Wilson did appoint his close friend, the Justice Louis Brandeis, to the Supreme Court of the United States. He was the first Jewish American to sit on the nation's highest court. Wilson's agenda, which passed Congress at the end of 1913, included tariffs, banking, and labor reforms, and introduced the income tax. Thank Woodrow Wilson for signing it into law, except he didn't do it. The income tax was a constitutional amendment passed in 1913, and Wilson did very little to implement it. Wilson also expanded the executive branch with the creation of the Federal Reserve, Federal Trade Commission, and the Internal Revenue Service. He also embraced and encouraged new technology. He started airmail service, endorsed the creation of the interstate highway system. William Howard Taft, who was the outgoing president, became the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, June 30th, 1921, and stayed in the position until February 3rd, 1930. He died a month later. Women did get the right to vote, eventually. Most American women did get that right to vote, the Constitutional Amendment, 1920. Not all women got the right to vote, 1920. In 1920, Native Americans were not allowed to be U.S. citizens, so the Federal Amendment did not give them the right to vote. Under the Snyder Act in 1924, American-born Native women gained citizenship. As late as 1962, individual states still prevented some women from voting by the use of literacy tests, poll taxes, and claiming that the residents on reservations meant that one was not a resident of that state. Native-born Asian Americans had U.S. citizenship, but the first generation of Asian Americans did not. Asian American immigrant women were therefore excluded from voting until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 allowed them to gain citizenship more than 3 decades after the 19th Amendment was passed. The poll tax gone in 1964. That is the Gaza-Israeli war from October of 2023. Israel became a country on May 14, 1948, and the Prime Minister was David Ben-Gurion. It was a long struggle to get a nation with many confrontations prior to 1948. Egypt and Israel have a peace treaty. Tensions remain high in the Middle East. 5 major wars between Arabs and Israelis. 1948, 1956, 67, 73, and 82. And then there's the war that started October 7th, 2023. Hamas attacked Israel, starting another conflict. This is Archduke Ferdinand, Franz Ferdinand. Today is the 26th. And on Friday, it is Franz Ferdinand Day, because on Friday, it's June 28th, and June 28th, 1914 is when he was assassinated, and the First World War is on the horizon. The assassination of the Archduke on the Sarajevo street in Serbia on June 28th was the catalyst that started World War I. That war ended on November 11th, 1918 with an armistice, 20 million deaths, 21 million wounded during the war. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist after the war. There was a new government installed in 1914 in Mexico. Henry Ford revolutionized business, but he was truly a horrible human being. Mutual movies, Make Time Flies. Well, the suit against Ohio and the Industrial Commission of Ohio, 1915, goes before the Supreme Court. 9-0. The Supreme Court rules in favor of the Ohio Constitution and said that movies, silent movies, nobody spoke in these movies did not have First Amendment freedom of speech protection under the United States Constitution. The court overturned that ruling in 1952 in another case and conceded the First Amendment of the United States Constitution protects motion pictures because they are a form of expression through art. This is a picture of the Woolworth Building. Come on. The Woolworth Building was the tallest building in the world from 1913 to 1930. You might have heard of its replacement, Empire State Building. One of the 100 tallest buildings in the United States to this day. Top 30 floors sold to a developer in 2012, converted into residences. Office and commercial tenants use the rest of the building. The Woolworth Building has been a National Historic Landmark since 1966, and New York City designated it as a landmark in 1983. Hey, there I am driving. Well, actually, I let my wife drive the Model T there. See the USA. That's a Chevrolet, but we're in that car because they let you in that car. The United States Congress began funding roadways through the Federal Aid Road Act of 1916. It started an effort to construct a national road grid with the passage of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1921. In 1926, the United States numbered highway system was established. Route 66 was originally Route 62. They changed their name, which is a good thing for Bobby Troop, because I don't know, could you get your kicks on Route 62? Change it to 66. The modern interstate system was created with a Federal Highway Act of 1956, enacted June 26, 1956, when the President, Dwight Eisenhower, signed the bill into law. There are the New York Yankees, and in this picture, Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio. The New York Yankees franchise is worth billions of dollars. Some economists have put a $7.1 billion valuation on the business. A baseball team, of course, is worth whatever someone will pay for it. The team transcends baseball and is a global brand. Jackie Kennedy, 1975. On August 2nd, 1967, New York City's recently established Landmarks Preservation Commission designated Grand Central Terminal as a landmark. In 1968, Penn Central leased Grand Central Terminal to a developer UGP Properties, who proposed building a 55-story tower designed by Marcel Brewer above Grand Central. The terminal's facade would have been preserved, yet unviewable, and the entire main waiting room and part of the main concourse would have been demolished. That's when people like Jackie Kennedy got involved. Penn Station filed an $8 million lawsuit against the city of New York, which was blocking the renovation. Litigation lasted for nearly a decade. City leaders, including Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis and Brendan Gill, rallied against charges, and in December 1976, the National Register of Historic Places named Grand Central Terminal as a National Historic Landmark. Grand Central Terminal has undergone extensive renovation since its designation as a national monument. Crossword puzzle, still a feature of newspapers. Oh, November 3rd, 1914, the U.S. Patent Office issued a patent for the backless brassiere. Mary Phelps Jacobs' patent for the device was lightweight, soft, separated the breast naturally. The patent office said, go ahead. Mary and her second husband, Harry Crosby, founded the Black Sun Press, and they produced some of the early works of people like Kay Boyle, Ernest Hemingway, Hart Crane, and D.H. Lawrence. Well, thank you so much for listening. Any questions, any comments?